Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. We've got a fast evolving situation again today across Iran, the Gulf, and the wider Middle East. But the key shift isn't that the core issues have changed, it's that the system is starting to accumulate implementation weight. In other words, the agreements, waivers, and mechanisms are starting to turn into real world pressure points that are harder to unwind than they were to announce. And the biggest update right now is that the US Iran diplomatic track is still holding together, but the substance underneath it is starting to diverge in a very visible way. Let's jump straight into it. The most important development is that Washington is now actively operationalizing sanctions relief, while Tehran continues to publicly deny that any meaningful nuclear concessions have been made. Vice President J.D. Vance is describing progress in Switzerland as a very good foundation for a final deal. That framing is important because it signals momentum and structure. But Iranian officials are essentially pushing back on the same point, saying they have not entered into new binding commitments on the nuclear program and that discussions remain conditional. So, what you're seeing is a widening gap between process confidence in Washington and substance caution in Tehran. And that gap becomes more important when you layer in what's actually being implemented. The U.S. Treasury has now waived sanctions tied to Iranian oil exports and related financial services for a 60-day window. That includes banking, insurance, and shipping channels. And this is not just theoretical relief. It directly enables Iranian crude to re-enter more conventional global trade pathways, including dollar-based settlement channels that had been effectively closed off for years. That matters because it changes Iran's immediate liquidity position. It also changes leverage in negotiations. Tehran is now receiving tangible economic upside before final agreement terms on nuclear restrictions are locked in. At the same time, there is a second layer developing around frozen Iranian assets. Washington has floated the idea that released funds would be directed into controlled commodity purchases, including U.S. agricultural goods. Iranian officials are rejecting that framing and insisting that asset use decisions remain entirely sovereign. So even within the relief category, there is still a control dispute over who ultimately decides how money flows. Now zoom out to the nuclear issue, because this is still the central strategic question sitting under everything else. The U.S. position is that Iran should move toward readmitting International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, potentially restoring monitoring access to facilities that were damaged or restricted after the last major escalation cycle. That would be a key step toward verification of stockpiles and enrichment activity. But Tehran is not confirming that interpretation. Iranian officials have said there are no new commitments regarding inspections and that engagement with the IAEA continues under existing legal frameworks and internal approval processes. That creates a very specific kind of ambiguity. Inspectors may be discussed, but access is not yet guaranteed. And the scope of any access is still undefined. And underneath that, one unresolved variable continues to dominate long-term assessments: the location and status of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile after strikes on key enrichment facilities last year. Until that is resolved, any inspection framework remains incomplete. Now shift to the maritime domain, because the Strait of Hormuz is becoming its own negotiation ecosystem. The U.S. and Iran have agreed to establish a communication channel designed to prevent escalation incidents involving commercial shipping in the strait. On the surface, this is about deconfliction and avoiding miscalculation. But Iran is simultaneously building out regulatory infrastructure around the waterway. New insurance mechanisms and vessel registration requirements are being introduced under Iranian-linked authorities. Shipping analysts are reading this as an attempt to normalize Iranian oversight over transit behavior in the strait. That is important because it shifts leverage from pure military disruption risk toward administrative and financial friction. Even without closing the strait, you can influence cost, routing behavior, and insurance exposure. And that is already feeding into global market sensitivity. Energy flows through Hormuz are one of the key stabilizers of global pricing, and even perceived uncertainty is enough to ripple through oil markets and shipping insurance premiums. Now move to Lebanon, where the diplomatic architecture is arguably the most structurally significant change in the broader regional system. A new deconfliction mechanism has been established involving the US, Iran, Qatar, Pakistan, and Lebanese authorities. The stated goal is to manage ceasefire implementation and reduce escalation risk between Israel and Hezbollah. But the structure itself is the strategic story. Israel is not included in this mechanism. That represents a major departure from previous arrangements that allowed Israel to directly report violations and coordinate responses through a shared monitoring system. In the new setup, Israel's role becomes indirect, routed through U.S. channels rather than direct participation. That changes both timing and transparency. It also changes who controls escalation narratives in real time. At the same time, Israel is maintaining a security posture in southern Lebanon and continuing operational activity aimed at Hezbollah infrastructure. So even as diplomatic systems are being constructed, military enforcement logic has not been paused. This creates an overlapping system where diplomacy is trying to regulate a conflict that is still actively being managed on the ground. Zooming out again, the political layer in Washington, Tehran, and across the region is starting to feel the pressure of sequencing. In the U.S., debate is centering on whether sanctions relief is moving too quickly relative to verification milestones. Supporters argue the framework stabilizes energy markets and prevents escalation. Critics argue it front-loads concessions before nuclear constraints are locked in. Inside Iran, the challenge is different. The leadership is trying to translate external relief into internal stability. Inflation pressures, war-related economic damage, and political fragmentation between hardline and pragmatic blocs are all shaping how far Tehran is willing to go in formalizing commitments. And all of this is happening while the broader region remains unstable. Gaza and the West Bank continue to see periodic violence that keeps political pressure high. These events do not directly drive the U.S.-Iran negotiation, but they reinforce a broader environment where escalation risk never fully disappears from the system. There is also a quieter but important layer in the background involving information control and connectivity. Reports of efforts to introduce external satellite communications into Iran highlight that influence competition is still active beneath the diplomatic surface. That matters because if talks fail, those same tools become part of escalation dynamics again. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.